This channel grows only with your support. Like, subscribe, and leave a comment. It actually matters. Randall Price, 34 years old and carrying the psychic weight of the 600 square miles separating him from his former life, inhaled the Montana air. This was not the thick, recycled, dusty climate of the regional accounting office where he had spent the last decade staring at spreadsheets. This was air that scraped the inside of his lungs, high and dry and smelling faintly of sun-bleached pine and granite dust. He stood in the yard, his old sedan looking ridiculously small next to the vast empty sky, experiencing an immediate, alien peace. This place, bequeathed to him by a man he barely remembered meeting as a small child, settled around him like a heavy shroud. The ranch house stood just inside a thin stand of faded, sun-yellowed pines. It was quiet. Too quiet. A natural silence, the kind found miles from anything, usually carries a hum, the buzz of insects, the nervous chatter of birds, the constant background noise of organic life striving to survive. Here, there was none of that. Only the dry, whistling sigh of the wind pushing through the cracks of the weathered gray plank siding. It was an isolating kind of quiet, a vacuum that sucked the sound right out of the world. Randall felt he stood at the bottom of a deep, empty well. He wrestled his luggage out of the trunk, the metal scraping echoing too loudly in the stillness, and stepped inside. The door groaned like a dying thing on its heavy hinges. The interior immediately hit him with a bouquet of smells: turpentine, ancient wood that had dried and contracted 1,000 times over the decades, and a sharp, subtle metallic tang. Randall identified the scent of an old workshop, cutting oil and galvanized steel, but this was saltier, sharper, sitting on the tongue like a piece of old copper. The house was minimalist, almost Spartan. No pictures, no clutter, the wooden floorboards swept clean. It looked evacuated, not lived in. The cleanliness was hasty, almost careless, as if the previous occupants had fled in a hurry, careful only to leave nothing personal behind, like criminals erasing fingerprints. The realization that this was not a home, but a stage set left behind, raised the fine hairs on Randall's arms. 100 yards from the back door, tucked against a slight rise, stood the outbuilding. It was not a barn. It was a bunker. Constructed of thick, fortress-like timber logs, the structure dwarfed the shed he had back home as a kid. The door was the real attention-getter. It was truly secured. 3 massive, crude steel bolts, hand-forged and thick as his arm, held the door shut, supplemented by a huge black padlock easily the size of a child's fist. It was designed to ensure nothing, absolutely nothing, could get out. Randall felt a cold spear of genuine, unspoken anxiety pierce his gut. One does not take precautions like that against a few tools or some sacks of feed. One secures something that desperately wants to break loose. He walked to the mailbox, a rusting, dented thing mounted on a crooked post by the dirt road. It was empty save for one item jammed deep into the far corner. A piece of heavy, folded paper, densely packed, typed out on an antique machine. No signature, no address, utterly devoid of personality. Randall unfolded it, the paper crackling like old corn husks. The text was brutally concise. "Feed 'em, no later than 12 o'clock ante-meridium, and walk 'em far from the trees." He reread it 3 times, his mind grasping for the joke, the prank, the obvious context he missed. There was none. It was an obligation, cold and unyielding, like a contract sealed in frozen wax. It was not a request. It was an imperative, based on an assumption of compliance. The true weight of his strange inheritance settled on him then, heavier than the Montana sky. The afternoon bled into evening quickly in the high country. The sun, a bloated orange smear, dipped behind the jagged, saw-toothed horizon, and the light went out like a thrown switch. Night came not as a gentle darkening, but as a deep, smothering blackness. It felt like a tangible physical pressure pushing down on the roof of the house. Randall sat on the porch steps, the cold rising up through the worn planks, clutching the key to the shed in his sweaty palm. His rational mind had fled, replaced by a cold, primal calculation. He thought about calling the sheriff, but what would he say? That he inherited a ranch and a note that told him to walk something by 12 o'clock ante meridiem? He knew he would sound like he belonged in the county asylum. He checked his watch. 10:30 post meridium. The silence had returned, deeper than before, heavier. The air around the house congealed, thick and still. Then, for the first time since he arrived, the oppressive silence tore apart. It was a sound that did not belong in the natural world. It was low, deep, and impossibly thick, a sustained guttural hum that did not vibrate the air but vibrated the very earth under the porch. It came from the direction of the fortified shed. It was not a happy sound. It was the sound of something huge, powerful, and deeply, truly unhappy waiting for its time. Randall's hands stopped shaking, replaced by a terrible, paralyzing certainty. He would not be leaving this ranch tonight. He stood up, his knees feeling like worn rubber bands, and started walking toward the bunker, toward the sound of enormous, banked hunger. He knew, with the unshakable conviction that hits you only when the curtain has been drawn back on the stage of reality, that whatever was inside that shed expected him, and it was getting ready. The kitchen clock, an ugly yellow plastic thing that ran 10 minutes fast, clunked heavily toward the hour. At exactly 12 o'clock ante meridiem, it delivered 12 thick, deliberate strikes that sounded in the small house like funeral bells being rung by an amateur. The moment the final chime faded, the sound from the shed began again. This was not the deep, rumbling hum from earlier. This was worse. It was a dull, heavy, sickening groan, a tearing, grinding sound, the noise of anatomy being violently and unwillingly rearranged. It was the pure, unvarnished sound of biological machinery grinding itself into a new, dreadful configuration. There was no theatrical howl, no dramatic special effect, just the wet, grinding, agonizing reality of fiber and bone reforming itself into something entirely unnatural. Randall's hand was slick with sweat as he fumbled with the cold, heavy metal of the padlock. He finally managed to get the key turned, the heavy steel tumbling free. The clang of the lock hitting the dirt was deafening. He slid the 3 immense bolts back, each one screeching in protest, sounding like the scream of a trapped thing. He pulled the thick timber door inward. A wave of air rushed out, thick and hot, hitting him in the face like a physical blow. It smelled of damp, loose earth, musky, overheating fur, and something sharp and metallic, undeniably the raw, salty tang of fresh, wet blood. But where did the blood come from? He had not fed them yet. The realization that the blood smell was them was part of the ongoing internal cost of their change, made his stomach heave. He raised the battery-powered lantern he had brought, a heavy industrial flashlight meant for construction sites, its beam a sickly yellow cone cutting the absolute black. 4 figures stood silently in the deep shadow of the shed's interior. They were immense, filling the space with impossible bulk. They stood on 2 legs, but the vertical line was all wrong. Shoulders were too wide, the neck too thick, the head thrust forward. They were massive, heavy entities, their outlines blurred by the dark, but possessing a terrifying, distorted approximation of human posture. He was looking at them, the werewolves. Their eyes caught the weak lantern light. They simply reflected the light back, an eerie, pale yellow spark in the darkness. There was a wildness in those sparks, a ravenous fire, but Randall saw something else too. A thin, almost invisible thread of deep, weary human consciousness flickering behind the bestial hunger. The 4 figures moved slowly, heavily toward the doorway, their massive forms swallowing the light. They paced, their feet falling with the deliberation of beings who knew their immense power and its need for control. Morgan Doyle, Randall somehow knew the name instantly, was slightly in front, the largest of the group, his chest impossibly deep. He let out a low, impatient rumble that was not quite a growl, but certainly not a cough. It was a sound of sheer, unadulterated need. Randall realized they were not mythical beasts born of moonlight and curses, but biological entities trapped in a painful, cyclical existence. He looked at the powerful, heavily muscled forearm of the one he knew as Roy Benz, his mind reeling. Roy had been a high school geometry teacher. Now, just a few feet from Randall, the creatures stopped, crowding the doorway. In the silence, Morgan spoke. It was a low, vibrating, utterly articulate voice, gravelly and thick, voiced through a throat lined with sandpaper. "You're late, Keeper." Randall swallowed, the sound scraping in his own throat. 12 o'clock anti-meridium just struck. I'm on time. 12 o'clock anti-meridium is the transformation, Morgan corrected, his yellow eyes holding Randall's with terrifying intelligence. The feeding must commence after the transformation is complete. We need to move. The sheer normalcy of the conversation, the businesslike quality of the demand, layered a new stratum of horror onto the existing fear. They were not just animals. They were men trapped inside animals, forced to maintain grotesque schedules. Morgan explained, speaking for the others, Pike Ranson, the most tightly coiled and dangerous-looking, and Nolan Quinn, quieter, his gaze more distant. He told Randall that the human form was simply a necessary hibernation, a brief, fragile reprieve from the consuming fundamental hunger that defined their nights. That hunger, he stressed, could not be ignored. It was a constant, driving force. And if it was not satisfied by the 12 o'clock ante-meridium hour, it began to eat away at the thin shell of their control, making the transition back to humanity increasingly difficult or eventually impossible. Randall saw the array of thick chains and galvanized steel troughs bolted to the shed's far wall. They were untouched, dusty, and unused. Harris had stopped trying to cage them years before. The true security measure was not the locks on the outside, but the voluntary cooperation of the intelligence on the inside. Harris had given them the freedom of the shed, forcing them to rely on their keeper. The overwhelming realization was that Randall was not their warden. He was their lifeline. He was the only thing preventing these 4 immense, hungry creatures from dissolving into pure, unthinking mechanical slaughter. They needed him to maintain structure, to remember the time, and to keep the world safe from their terrible, consuming hunger. The weight of the keys in his hand suddenly felt like 4 lifetimes of damnation. Morgan took another heavy step, closing the distance, forcing Randall to back up until his shoulder blades hit the house siding. The creature's breath smelled metallic and strangely sweet, like fresh-tilled earth left in the sun. "The arrangement," Morgan rasped, his voice vibrating deep in his massive chest, "is old. It precedes us all. We are not your captives, and you are not our master. But you are essential. You are the structure." Randall nodded, finding his voice a low, dry croak. The note said, "Feed them, walk them. We must feed, yes, but only on what is wild. Only on the creatures that belong to the darkness. We do not touch man," Morgan stated, his voice carrying the authority of an oath sworn millennia ago. "That is the rule. That is the only way we keep the sanity, the Doyle inside the beast." He explained the need for supervision. In this form, the impulse to hunt was overwhelming, a biological imperative that short-circuited higher reasoning. They required an external conscience, someone whose presence reminded the creature that there was a line, a contract, a human existence to which they must return. The most critical rule, he emphasized, was distance. "Our senses are hypertrophied," Nolan murmured from the back, his voice surprisingly soft despite the guttural undertone. "The scent of man, the scent of fear, the scent of fresh blood, all travel hell and gone on the wind up here. If we are too close, the animal overrides the man. We need distance, Randall. Maximum distance from any settlement, any house, any road that carries travelers." Randall felt the immense, impossible weight of the burden. He was responsible not just for 4 afflicted men, but for the entire human population within 100 miles. If he failed, if he let them slip their control, the resulting carnage would be total and absolute. "And the time limit?" Randall asked, looking over his shoulder toward the faint purple hue already beginning to stain the eastern horizon, the precursor to dawn. "Dawn," Morgan confirmed, the word sounding like doom. "We must be back in the confines before the first direct ray of sunlight hits our skin. If we do not return, the transformation will be fixed. Permanent. We will remain as you see us, but the man inside will die. We will be only the engine. And then, this little corner of Montana becomes a zone of pure, unstoppable terror." The certainty in his voice was terrifying. Randall recognized the cold, clinical assessment of a catastrophic failure mode. He motioned toward the old, heavy-duty utility pickup truck parked on the gravel drive. It was rusting slightly, but clearly well-maintained and sturdy enough for the high country. "Get in the truck," Randall ordered, the command surprising even himself. He was already adopting the mantle of the keeper, the shepherd of monsters. The creatures responded instantly. Despite their great weight and unnatural mass, they moved with an astonishing heavy grace. They leaped into the bed of the pickup, the suspension groaning under the sudden load. They settled down, huge, silent silhouettes against the backdrop of the night. Randall slid behind the steering wheel. The old truck roared to life, the noise comforting in its familiarity, a small island of the known in a sea of encroaching horror. He put the vehicle into gear, the tires spitting gravel, and headed out into the pitch black, driving toward the deepest, most isolated tracts of the forest Harris Price had meticulously charted on an old map Randall had found folded in the glove compartment. The drive was harrowing. The dirt road was barely discernible in the faint wash of the headlamps. Randall felt the immense, powerful tension radiating from the cargo bay behind him. The air was charged with anticipation, a dense, humming readiness for violence. After 15 minutes of bone-jarring bouncing over ruts and rocks, he stopped deep in a ravine, surrounded by dense lodgepole pine. He killed the engine, and the resulting silence was immediate and profound, broken only by the loud tick-tick-tick of the cooling engine block. Randall did not need to speak. The four immense shapes rose from the truck bed and vaulted over the sides with effortless power. They did not run like animals. They moved with a powerful, purposeful velocity, melting into the shadows of the forest floor instantly. Randall sat rigid behind the wheel, staring into the impenetrable gloom. He gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles were white. A few minutes passed. Long, thick, suffocating minutes, and then the silence was broken. Not by 4 sets of heavy footsteps, but by a sound Randall had never conceived of. It was an inhumanly high, piercing squeal, full of panic and pain, followed instantly by a low, furious rumble and the sickening, wet, heavy sound of tearing, followed by loud, relentless slurping and chewing. Randall slammed his eyes shut, his entire body trembling. He inhaled the cold night air, and now it was not just pine and earth. It was a potent, sharp scent of raw, hot iron and a chemical, aggressive fury that emanated directly from the dark woods. The feeding had begun, and he had to wait for them to finish. Randall sat through what felt like an eternity, though the kitchen clock in his mind registered barely 40 minutes. The sounds of the forest, once silent and foreboding, had become a terrible symphony of life and death. He realized the quiet was not natural. It was the nervous silence of everything else listening to the wolves feed. The Montana woods he had only read about in tourist guides, picturing gentle hiking trails and postcard views, were in reality a vast, predatory domain. A place where everything was acutely aware of what was hunting and what was being hunted. He felt acoustically blind in this environment. The occasional crack of a distant branch, the rustle of a small, frightened creature, the stressed, unnatural hush that preceded a surge of movement. All these sounds carried precise, immediate information to the creatures in the wood, information Randall's human ears failed to decode. He was just a noisy, fleshy presence, an anchor point, totally vulnerable to anything that moved silently. The sounds of the hunt ceased as abruptly as they had begun. The deep, heavy silence of sated hunger replaced the noise of carnage. After another 5 minutes of waiting, the four shapes emerged from the blackness, moving back toward the truck. They were darker now, coated in grime and something thick and viscous that glistened faintly in the low moonlight filtering through the pine needles. Their muzzles were glistening, their immense chests heaving with deep, controlled breaths. The frantic, yellow flare in their eyes had dimmed slightly. The immediate consuming demand of the hunger was gone. Their movements, though still heavy and powerful, were calmer, possessing a deliberate economy of motion. The crisis had passed. The required fuel had been consumed, and the thin veneer of control had been successfully maintained for another day. Randall reached for the ignition key, desperate to get back to the relative safety of the locked shed before the first signs of dawn appeared. But just as his fingers closed around the plastic head of the key, a new sound cut through the settling quiet. It came from the flank of the woods, perhaps 1/4 of 1 mile away. It was not the fast, panicky crackling of branches associated with a creature fleeing a predator. This sound was slow, powerful, and utterly deliberate. It was the sound of young, thick saplings being snapped and crushed, one by one with methodical, arrogant force. It felt demonstrative, like something moving not in fear but to announce its presence. Pike Ranson, who had already cleared the side of the truck bed, stiffened instantly. His massive, pointed ears flattened back against his skull, and his body coiled tautly. "That's not us," Morgan muttered, his head swiveling toward the sound. His massive nostrils flared wide, tasting the air. Nolan, his stance wide and defensive, added, "It's here. It's been following us, and it's not leaving." Randall felt a wave of pure, cold dread wash over him. He was no longer worried about the pack's lack of control. He was worried about an uninvited guest. The air temperature, which had been crisp and cold, suddenly felt dense and pressurized in the direction of the sounds. It was heavier, like a dense, wet blanket. He strained his eyes into the gloom. He saw nothing, not even a faint shift in the deep blackness. Yet he felt the intense, focused attention. The woods were not merely observing him as an intrusion. They were observing him as a possible meal, or worse, an irritating complication. "Who is it?" Randall whispered, the sound pathetic in the vast night. Morgan only issued a low, guttural, threatening sound deep in his chest. "Something that hunts us." They drove back fast, the truck swaying dangerously on the uneven trail. Randall felt the urgency in their collective need to reach the safety of the human form transition. The dawn was coming too fast, and they had been delayed by the unwelcome presence. They made it back to the ranch just as the horizon began to lighten to a weak industrial gray. Randall quickly unlocked the shed and held the door open as the four figures, exhausted and spent, lumbered inside. The transformation back was agonizing, slow, and wet, accompanied by soft, thick slurping sounds as their forms receded, melting into the heavy, muscular contours of the men. When the transformation was complete, and the four men, naked and sweating, leaned against the rough plank walls, Randall noticed the damage. Pike Ranson, who had been most agitated, had a deep tear in his left shoulder. It was not a scratch. The flesh was peeled back, exposing muscle. Randall hurried over with the medical supplies he had unpacked. The wound was deep, yet strangely clean at the edges, not jagged like a tooth tear, nor raked like a massive claw mark. The flesh had been pounded and torn by blunt, incredibly powerful instruments, as if someone had hit him with a rock hammer, and then pulled the wound apart. Pike grimaced, his teeth clenched, his human eyes now showing the strain. Morgan looked at the wound, his face grim and exhausted. "It's here, Randall. The one Harris wrote about." He met Randall's gaze, his eyes sharp and serious. "We are not the apex predator in these woods anymore. And whatever this thing is, it does not just want to eat. It wants to eliminate us." The following day, Randall felt the exhaustion deep in his bones, but the rising anxiety would not allow him rest. The image of Pike's strange, brutal wound kept flashing in his mind. He needed context, desperately. He needed Harris Price's history. Randall was looking for a first aid kit Harris must have kept, and rooting around in the cluttered corner of the master bedroom, his foot struck something loose beneath the worn floorboards. He pried up a section with a screwdriver, revealing a shallow, locked compartment. Inside, beneath a layer of fine dust, was a thick, leather-bound journal. It was heavy, its pages dog-eared and stiff. Randall recognized the pervasive scent of it immediately, not just dust and age, but pipe smoke and a profound, lingering scent of tragedy. The first entry was dated 25 years earlier. The handwriting was tight, nervous, almost frantic, the clear script of a man wrestling with impossible truths. Harris Price had detailed not mythical monsters, but afflicted men. He wrote about the unbearable physical and psychic burden of their cyclical existence, the constant debilitating pain of the transformation, and the relentless driving shame that followed the feeding. He described them as sick, cursed, but fundamentally good men who were fighting a war inside their own bodies every night. He wrote about the necessity of isolation. They had tried everything: medicine, religion, spiritual rituals, but only rigorous isolation and controlled feeding prevented them from losing their minds entirely. To survive, Harris concluded, they needed a governing structure, an external sane presence, a human anchor who held the keys and remembered the clock. Randall spent the entire afternoon sitting by the dusty window, reading Harris's chronicle. He read how Roy Benz had once been a kind, gentle soul who wept after a particularly violent transformation, horrified by what his body had done. He read how Morgan Doyle had dedicated his human life to finding others like them, to helping them isolate themselves and find control, only to realize the curse was too strong to break. Then came the staggering revelation about Randall himself. Harris was not a relative. Randall Price, at the age of 5, had been found by Harris in a ruined, blood-soaked farmhouse 50 miles away, the apparent sole survivor of an unnamed calamity. Harris had saved him, given him his own name, and raised him not as a son, but as a continuity plan. The ranch was not a gift. It was a destiny. Randall was the designated keeper, the last line of defense for these 4 afflicted men, their insurance against total, irreversible savagery. Randall's world tilted. He had not inherited a piece of property. He had inherited 4 lives and the entire moral consequence of keeping them in check. His weakness, his fear, his incompetence. These were no longer just personal failures. They were potential global catastrophes. Harris's philosophical notes were what truly chilled him. He wrote about the thin, taut wire separating the men from the beasts. As long as they maintained the human core, the realization of their predicament, the understanding of the rules, they were capable of empathy and restraint. Without that core, without the external anchor, they became pure mechanical horrors, driven only by the efficient consumption of life. The final few months of the journal focused on a new terror. Harris began referring to an other kind. It watches the perimeter, Harris wrote in a spidery hand. Not a wolf, not a bear, nor anything known in the taxonomy of this land. It is large, misshapen, and moves with a kind of casual physical malice. It does not fear the pack. It does not hide from us. It hunts us. It regards Morgan and the others as weak rivals, or worse, as interesting prey. It hunts not for sustenance, but for the pleasure of the breaking. Harris's last entry was simple and terrifyingly prophetic. It is forcing a confrontation. It is pushing them past the point of their control. I don't know how much longer I can keep the structure intact. Randall closed the heavy journal. His hands, which had trembled constantly since his arrival, were suddenly steady. The fear had not lessened, but it had been channeled into a terrible, absolute clarity. He was no longer a confused inheritor. He was the keeper of the line. And there was something in the woods that wanted to wipe the line away and let the chaos run free. Night fell with renewed menace. The air itself felt different, sharper, infused with the knowledge of danger. When Randall drove the truck out for the evening run, earlier tonight, ignoring the note's instruction but needing the cushion of time, he noticed the changes in the familiar woods he had driven through the previous nights. The geography of the forest had been subtly but brutally rearranged. The undergrowth was not simply pushed aside. It was pulped. Young trees, thick saplings that should have resisted a passing bear, were snapped off at the base, not torn or chewed, but cleanly crushed, as if a gigantic, careless hand had simply swept them aside. It suggested a passage of immense, heedless power. As Randall drove, the air conditioning unit of the truck, struggling to keep the cabin cool against the rising heat of the engine and Randall's nerves, pulled in the scent. It was there again, now much stronger than the first faint whiff. Not just pine and wet earth, but a thick, sickly chemical smell, reminiscent of rancid fat and a deep, unpleasant sulfur. It was the stench of something fundamentally foul, a smell that did not belong in the clean, cold mountain air. Nolan, seated in the truck bed, leaned against the cab, his face, now the face of the beast, slick with transforming moisture, pressed close to the rear window. His yellow eyes, usually reserved, were intensely alert. "He is close," Nolan's low, throaty voice rumbled, the sound vibrating the glass. "He is watching the road. He waits for us to be distracted." The tension was suffocating. Randall drove deeper, to the exact spot where the previous night's confrontation had occurred, hoping the familiarity of the hunting ground would settle the pack. He stopped the truck, killed the motor, and stepped out, the gravel crunching under his boots. He needed to verify what he already knew. He walked toward the stream bed, where the soil was soft and muddy, illuminated by the sickly yellow of the truck's headlamps. There they were, the tracks. They were gigantic, each impression easily twice the size of Roy's massive paw prints. They were not structured like a wolf's paw, nor like a bear's flat foot. They were primitive, five-toed, wide and flat, ending in thick, dull, powerful indentations where the claws dragged. The only analogy Randall could find was something deeply, profoundly archaic, a track left by some vast, clumsy, powerful child. The track depth indicated enormous weight, far exceeding the combined mass of the 4 creatures in the truck bed. Randall looked up, adrenaline beginning to pump, making the world seem sharp and brittle. The biggest sign was the profound quiet that enveloped them. The normal symphony of the night was gone. The forest was not merely hushed, it was dead. No insect chirped, no owl called, no coyote howled to the moon. Predators, Randall knew, even the most silent ones, produced some noise. They made their presence known through the subtle shifts in the environment. This new predator, the gulper, as Harris had grimly named it in the journal, negated the surrounding world by its sheer presence, demanding absolute, terrified silence. Randall gripped the heavy wrench he now kept in the front seat, a pathetic barrier against what was stalking them. The moment the 4 creatures launched themselves from the truck and dissolved into the trees, Randall felt the profound weight of being observed. The heat on the back of his neck was immediate and focused. He spun around, shining the construction lantern wildly into the deep forest. For a fraction of 1 second he saw it. It was immense, a massive, dark brown, hunchbacked silhouette. It did not reflect the light, it devoured it. It was positioned impossibly high, standing above the young pines. It was a grotesque blend of something human and something overwhelmingly Ursine, its limbs too thick, its posture permanently stooped and terrible. As Randall watched, paralyzed, the creature began to move. It was not running or sneaking. It was moving with slow, powerful confidence, and as it did, the thick tree trunks around it began to stress, creaking and groaning under the force of its passage. Randall fumbled, dropping the wrench. The monster was closing the distance, not chasing prey, but stalking a threat. Randall scrambled back into the cab, slamming the door and locking it, the action utterly meaningless against that kind of power. He heard the first frantic sounds of the pack's hunt, quickly followed by the distinct sound of a massive counterattack. The heavy, sickening thud of two enormous bodies colliding in the deep woods. The Gulper had found them. Randall knew with chilling certainty that this time he was not safe even within the steel and glass cage of the truck. The confrontation Harris Price had feared was upon them. The air was thick with panic and sulfur. On the third night of the Gulper's presence, the werewolves were intensely stressed. They had failed to find suitable prey, their nervous energy and the constant looming threat of the other creature having scared off the local game. They were hungry, tired, and dangerously close to losing the thin, invisible thread of control that bound them. The tension peaked when the creature decided to show itself fully. It did not charge from the woods. It simply stepped out of the shadow of the thickest pines, emerging into the center of the clearing directly in front of the headlamps of Randall's pickup. The Gulper was worse than Randall's brief glimpse had prepared him for. It was a terrifying muscular amalgamation, standing at least 8 feet tall, a bulky, shifting silhouette of raw power. It was indeed a clumsy hybrid of man and something else, but its neck was almost non-existent, its massive, conical head settling directly on its humped shoulders. Its hide looked thick and wet, the color of spoiled liver, covered in sparse, patchy, coarse hair. Its face was the purest horror. Its snout was stubby, but its mouth hinged unnaturally low, opening impossibly wide, almost down to its sternum, revealing rows of blunt, heavy teeth, perfect for crushing bone. In its eyes, pinpoint, red, and entirely devoid of intelligence, Randall saw only a deep, ancient hatred. This was not a creature of tragedy or cursed humanity. This was a force of pure biological malice. Harris's journal had been right. The werewolves, though horrific, maintained their structure by feeding for survival. The Gulper, by all accounts, killed everything: wildlife, the occasional lost hiker, and most importantly, the pack, whom it viewed as an offensive disturbance of the natural order. It hunted for pleasure, for the sheer joy of rending. The moment it appeared, the 4 werewolves reacted instantly. They knew the danger. They moved with coordinated speed, not in a frantic rush, but in the disciplined formation of a seasoned hunting pack. They circled the Gulper, Roy and Morgan taking the flanks, Nolan and Pike moving low. The Gulper did not seem to notice the maneuvering. It moved with shocking, unexpected quickness for its bulk, targeting Nolan. Its attack was based on sheer kinetic force. The collision sounded like 2 cars smashing together. The Gulper swung one of its massive, paw-like forelimbs. It did not have claws, just thick, horny protuberances designed to bludgeon and tear. The blow caught Nolan squarely in the ribs, sending him flying 30 feet into the thicket. where he landed with a sickening crunch. Morgan and Roy lunged simultaneously, sinking their teeth into the gulper's thick, leathery flank. The gulper did not flinch. The werewolf's teeth, though powerful enough to shatter the thickest deer bone, scraped uselessly against the creature's hide, which looked and felt like damp, corrugated bark. This was not a successful hunt. This was a desperate, losing battle for survival. The gulper let out a sound of terrible metallic triumph, a high-pitched shriek like steel grinding on steel, and it began methodically swatting the four creatures away, one by one. Randall watched, paralyzed by the sight of the absolute ineffectual violence. He was supposed to be the anchor, the keeper, but he was just a human man watching four powerful predators being systematically dismantled by a fifth, more powerful and utterly insane creature. He looked down at the keys, then at the heavy hunting rifle he had bought that afternoon, currently useless in the locked safe back at the ranch. He had nothing. He had to intervene. Adrenaline, pure and potent, flooded his system. Randall slammed the transmission into gear, floored the accelerator, and aimed the old pickup directly at the immense dark mass of the gulper. The impact was not a solid hit. The gulper was too fast, too aware. It managed to pivot slightly, the truck hitting its hip and massive shoulder. The sheer force of the blow was still enormous. The truck bucked violently, throwing Randall against the steering wheel. The gulper let out an ear-splitting, furious sound, a sound that shredded the air itself, and it staggered back 3 heavy steps, temporarily disoriented by the unexpected, unnatural aggression of the machine. That single crucial moment was enough. Morgan, Roy, and Pike scrambled back, seizing the moment. Run. Randall screamed, his throat raw. Get out of here. The werewolves, momentarily distracted from their hunger by the immediate threat, obeyed. They vaulted back toward the cover of the pines, regrouping and vanishing into the darkness. Randall did not wait. He threw the truck into reverse, spun the wheel, and sped back the way he came, his heart hammering against his ribs, knowing he had just broken the sacred contract, using human tools to interfere with the natural order of their hunt. But he had saved them, at least for now. He was shaking violently, his breath coming in ragged, painful gasps, knowing he had just escalated the conflict to an entirely new, catastrophic level. The gulper would follow. The day following the confrontation was a waking nightmare. The men, returned to their human forms, were silent, radiating a deep, cold misery. Pike and Nolan were badly bruised and scraped, their human flesh mirroring the trauma their monstrous forms had endured. They knew the delicate, decade-long balance had been violently disrupted. The gulper was no longer a distant threat. It was a focused, relentless enemy. Randall tried to rest, but the image of the massive, wide-open maw and the feel of the truck shuddering violently on impact kept him rigid. He knew the creature had been angered, not deterred. The night arrived faster than usual, the shadows lengthening with alarming speed. By 9 o'clock post-meridium, 2 hours before the mandated transformation time, the air began to thicken again. The sickly, sweet, sulfuric smell returned, dense and cloying, settling over the ranch yard like swamp gas. The gulper was here. It had not waited for the pack to go out. It had violated the unspoken code that kept the deeper horrors of the woods away from human habitation. It was forcing the issue, stalking them on their own ground. The 4 men sat in the small living room, fully dressed but rigid with tension. They listened to the sounds outside. The slow, deliberate crunch of heavy weight on gravel. The faint, disturbing sound of wood being twisted and stressed. The creature was circling the house, testing the perimeter. In their human form, they were tragically, utterly helpless. They were just men, tired, injured, and staring down a mountain of pure, savage power. Morgan's face was a mask of cold fury and resignation. He approached Randall, who was pacing near the front window, peering through the draped curtain. "It's here to finish it," Morgan said, his voice flat. "It knows we are weak now. If it breaches the house, we are done. And worse, Randall, if we are destroyed here, it will go free. It will not have the human counterforce of a pack to worry about. You have to leave. Now." Randall looked at the 4 men, his keepers, the 4 pillars of his terrifying new reality. They were offering him an escape route, a chance to abandon his inherited terrible duty. He thought of the journal, Harris's prophecy. Without an anchor, they become something worse. He looked at the massive, dark stain of the gulper's shadow stretching across the front lawn. If he left, the monster would tear the men apart, then rampage out toward the settlements, unleashed and fully aware of its terrifying power. The internal monologue was brief and sharp. There was no choice. The structure had to be maintained, even if it meant breaking all the rules to save the ultimate rule. Randall walked straight to the kitchen drawer, pulled out the heavy set of keys, and walked toward the back door, toward the shed. His hand was perfectly steady. The adrenaline had burned off the last residue of his fear. He did not unlock the shed door. He stopped. He knew that if the men transformed now, they would be stronger. They would be ready to meet the creature on its own terms, not as cornered men, but as cornered beasts. He looked at the digital clock on the counter. 11:45 post-meridium. 15 minutes before 12 o'clock ante-meridium. 15 minutes before the mandated, safe transformation. Randall slid the bolts back, the scream of the heavy metal echoing through the house, masking the sounds of the gulper circling outside. He thrust the door open. "Get in there. Now," Randall screamed, his voice strained but full of cold authority. "Transform. We're not waiting." The men hesitated for a split second. Shock registered on their tired human faces. The rule was absolute. 12 o'clock ante-meridium. But then, hearing a terrible cracking sound behind the house, the sound of the gulper testing the integrity of the shed's far wall, they obeyed. The transformation was immediate, agonizing, and chaotic. It began in the doorway, a convulsive, rapid transition fueled by panic and necessity. Randall heard the heavy, sickening smash of bone against bone, the thick, wet sound of flesh tearing and expanding, and low, suffering moans. The 4 massive silhouettes burst out of the shed, rushing into the night. It was a catastrophic transformation, premature and deeply aggressive. They were not wolves seeking a walk. They were beasts driven by pure, murderous rage. They bolted into the darkness, seeking out the source of the pressure. The premature transformation had consequences. The 4 creatures that sprang from the shed were more animalistic, driven by blind, reflexive aggression, their fragile human core overwhelmed by the desperate early change. They tore into the night, not in search of sustenance, but in frantic pursuit of conflict. Randall understood his immediate critical task. He had to maintain the anchor. If he lost sight of them now, they would dissolve into the wild, never to return. becoming 4 autonomous engines of destruction before the Gulper even finished them. He jumped back into the pickup, the key grinding in the ignition. He put the pedal to the floor, rattling the engine, and aimed the vehicle into the darkness where the creatures had vanished. He drove over uneven ground, smashing through low brush, bouncing and rattling violently. The headlamps, cutting cones of sickly yellow light through the oppressive blackness, and the deafening roar of the motor were the only artifacts of civilization in this suddenly feral landscape. These were their tethers. The werewolves ran ahead, huge shadows moving with brutal speed. Occasionally, one would turn its head, the yellow eyes flashing in the reflected light, a brief, instinctive acknowledgement of the man who led them. The battle was not far. The Gulper had been waiting less than 1 mile from the ranch, near a low, rocky hill where the pines grew dense and tangled. Randall slammed the brake pedal down, bringing the truck to a jarring stop. He cut the engine. The sound that filled the sudden silence was terrifying, a cacophony of monstrous roaring, a high metallic shriek, and the heavy, continuous thud, thud, thud of bodies the size of small oxen colliding with brutal force. It sounded like the very earth was being pummeled. Randall fumbled in the toolbox, pulling out the heavy, 2-foot length of steel crowbar he kept for changing tires. It felt pathetically light and useless in his hand, but it was all he had. He sprinted toward the sound, crashing through the brush, ignoring the cuts on his arms and face. He found them in a small, blood-splattered clearing. The Gulper was immensely powerful. It had Nolan pinned beneath its massive bulk, and Roy was struggling, his teeth sunk uselessly into the creature's shoulder hide. Morgan was trying to find a purchase on the thick, corded neck of the beast, but kept being thrown off by convulsive spasms of the Gulper's body. The Gulper had Pike Ranson pressed against a thick pine trunk, its wide maw opening. Randall watched the massive, blunt teeth moving toward the spinal cord, preparing to shear the life out of the man-beast. In that instant, Randall forgot about fear, about strategy, about the rules of engagement. He was flooded by a pure, primal animal desperation, not for his own life, but for the creatures he had suddenly taken under his wing. He let out a scream that was thin and ragged, full of human pain and rage, and he rushed forward, swinging the crowbar high over his head. He brought the heavy steel bar down with all the force his frightened, adrenaline-fueled body could muster, aiming for the creature's flank. The crowbar struck the Gulper's hide with a flat, dull clank. It was like hitting a granite wall covered in wet leather. The blow did no damage whatsoever, but it was a distraction. The Gulper paused, turning its massive necklace head toward Randall, its red eyes fixed on the new, small, weak prey, and it let out a hiss, a horrible steaming sound. Randall caught the full, terrifying stench of it, sulfur, stale blood, and the metallic tang of deep biological decay. That single second, the moment the Gulper shifted its attention away from Pike, was all they needed. Morgan, Roy, and Nolan, acting with a synchronized focus that spoke of their desperate solidarity, surged forward. They simply threw their combined weight, hundreds of pounds of raw, furious muscle, onto the back of the Gulper's neck and shoulders. They pressed down, using gravity and velocity against the creature's unstable, columnar spine. It was the desperate final thrust of a unified, terrified pack. The battle lasted perhaps 30 more seconds, the longest half-minute Randall Price had ever experienced. The ground shook with the furious, desperate struggle of the four werewolves trying to find the one weak point in the Gulper's immense armor-plated bulk. They could not pierce the hide, but they used their weight, leveraging against the creature's unbalanced posture. They hung on, tearing and biting uselessly, but exerting enormous downward pressure on the exposed, thick cord of its neck. There was a sickening, loud snap, followed by a series of cracking, grinding noises like a heavy wooden beam splitting under pressure. Then, the massive dark silhouette of the Gulper buckled. It issued a single choked, rattling sound. Its legs gave way, and it crashed to the earth with a final, heavy thud. The silence that followed was absolute. Not the nervous quiet of the forest, but a total, profound acoustic vacuum. The air stopped moving. Randall felt as if he had gone momentarily deaf. The Gulper lay sprawled on the ground, its head twisted at an impossible angle, its primitive eyes staring blankly at the dark sky. The enormous beast that had terrorized the woods was still. Randall stood over the body, the crowbar heavy and slick in his hand. The weight of his own sudden, unplanned violence pressed down on him. They had destroyed the creature that hunted them. The four werewolves stood over their vanquished enemy. They were spent, panting, their thick, coarse fur covered in the sludge of the battle, dirt, sap, and the monster's foul, thick blood. They were exhausted, their great chests rising and falling heavily, the animalistic fury draining away, leaving only profound fatigue. Morgan was the first to turn his head. He looked at Randall, the man who had driven a truck into a monster and then charged into the fray with a tire iron. In the faint, ambient light, Randall met the yellow stare of the creature that was Morgan Doyle. The light in the eyes was still wild, still burning with residual violence, but there was a clear, unambiguous recognition. They no longer saw a weak, trembling man who held the keys. They saw a co-conspirator, a fierce protector, an indispensable part of their structure, one who had risked his human life for their survival. Randall was not just their keeper. He was, in that moment, part of their pack. The victory, however, was fleeting. The graying sky overhead was rapidly shifting to a cold, pale lavender. Dawn was less than 1 hour away. The brutal, unscheduled exertion meant the pack was already fighting the clock and severe physical exhaustion. Morgan let out a low, deep sound, the command for retreat. The four creatures turned their backs on the dead monster and began the arduous journey back to the ranch. The return was a terrible, desperate march. Pike Ranson, still suffering from the Gulper's earlier attack, stumbled. Morgan supported him, the injured beast leaning heavily on the less injured one, a quiet act of loyalty. They battled not only the pain and fatigue, but the relentless encroachment of the sunrise. Knowing that if the first ray of direct light hit them outside the shed, their transformation would seize up, leaving them trapped as beasts with no return ticket to sanity. Randall followed close behind in the truck, its engine humming low, the speed slow and steady. The four shapes were silhouetted against the rising light, their movements heavy and labored. As they reached the final bend in the dirt road, just a few hundred yards from the shed, Roy Benz, the geometry teacher trapped in the heart of a killing machine, faltered. He stopped by a small, muddy creek bed and turned his head. He looked at Randall. The human recognition that had flashed moments earlier was gone, replaced by a pure, terrifying, reflexive hunger. It was an uncontrolled flash of predatory demand turned directly toward the man. Roy's immense jaw sagged slightly, a low, guttural noise escaping his throat. Randall's blood ran cold. He realized with heart-stopping clarity that the intense exertion of the fight, the stress of the early transformation, and the overriding need for sustenance had frayed the edges of Roy's control. He was now looking at the thin, almost non-existent thread that kept the mechanical horror contained. The Gulper had been defeated, but the true threat, the collapse of their internal structure, remained. Randall swallowed hard. He knew absolutely how narrow the margin was. The final stretch was a blur of frantic energy. Randall drove the truck right up to the shed, leaving the engine idling. The four creatures stumbled inside, collapsing onto the straw-strewn floor. Randall slammed the heavy timber door shut, throwing the immense steel bolts into place, just as the first cold, direct rays of sunlight pierced the horizon, painting the dry Montana plains in a pale, unforgiving gold. He sank heavily onto the porch steps, physically and psychically exhausted, listening to the final necessary agony of the transformation inside. The change back was slow, agonizing, and audible. The squelching, wet sounds of receding mass, the soft clatter of bone realigning itself with painful precision. When the sounds finally stopped, replaced by the heavy, ragged breathing of four men, Randall knew the crisis was over. The beast had been worn away, and the man had been salvaged for another day. A few minutes later, he unlocked the shed and opened the door. The interior smelled fiercely of sweat, old blood, and relieved tension. Morgan Doyle stood, leaning against the wall, his human face drawn and haggard, his body covered in bruises and raw patches where the thick fur had receded too fast. But his eyes were clear, sharp, and focused. He approached Randall, his voice low and heavy with meaning. "You broke the rules, Keeper. You intervened. You commanded the early change. You put yourself in the maw of a monster. You could have met your fate." Randall simply nodded, gripping the crowbar still in his hand. "I had to stop the fight before it consumed you all." Morgan's weary expression softened into a profound, weighty acceptance. "You made us a pack, Randall. You did not stand aside and let the rules kill us. You are no longer merely the man with the keys. You are our keeper." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "That thing we destroyed, that Gulper, it was pure malice. But Randall, if we are left without you, if we lose the anchor, the internal man dies during the transformation. We will become something much, much worse than that Gulper. We won't be killing to survive. We'll be killing because that is the only function left. We'll be pure mechanics of hunger, without the code." He looked Randall directly in the eye, the appeal a heavy, desperate burden. "Don't let us become something worse." Randall Price, the office drone who could not balance his own checkbook without software, stood now, reeking of old blood and the foul sulfur of a dead creature, his body aching, his mind clear. He had arrived at this desolate ranch weak and directionless. He was now the sole barrier between four powerful, cyclical beasts and the rest of the world. The role was one of utter necessity. He nodded, accepting the mantle fully. "I won't." He closed the shed door, leaving the heavy four-way bolt system unsecured for the moment, and walked back to the house. The sun climbed higher, bathing the plains in a bright, pale morning light. The quiet was almost peaceful now, the terrible acoustic vacuum gone. The crickets chirped, a distant bird sang, the natural world reclaiming its voice. Randall went into the kitchen and started the percolator. the sound of the bubbling coffee an immense comfort. He poured a stiff cup of black coffee and drank it standing by the window, watching the heat haze begin to shimmer over the dry fields. He did not bother checking his calendar or worrying about bills or calling a lawyer. His mind was already ticking toward the next cycle. He knew that by the time the shadows lengthened and the dry Montana wind began to carry the cold promise of night, his 4 charges would be waking up inside the shed, their hunger banked but growing. He would have to prepare the pickup. He would have to gather the keys. Randall Price, the keeper of midnight, finished his coffee. The walk would be long, and his pack would be hungry again.